Have you ever lost something you loved, not to an act of God, but to an act of committee? Not to a storm or sickness, but to a three-ring binder full of bylaws wielded by someone with a little too much time on their hands and not nearly enough soul? I have. My name is Arthur Pendleton, and for 40 years, I was a quiet man living a quiet life. I'm a retired cabinet maker, a widower, and until recently, the proud guardian of a magnificent 100-year-old oak tree. It stood in my front yard, a silent giant that my wife, Clara, and I had measured our lives against. Its branches held the tire swing our kids grew up on, and its shade was where Clara and I drank our iced tea on countless summer afternoons. It was more than a tree, it was family. And then, the Harmony Creek Homeowners Association, in the person of its newly elected president, Mildred Gable, decided it had to die. The official notice arrived on a Tuesday, a sterile white envelope that felt heavier than it should. It cited Section 7, Paragraph B of the HOA Covenants. Trees whose root systems pose a potential future risk to community-maintained infrastructure, such as sidewalks, may be deemed a nuisance and subject to mandatory removal at the homeowner's expense, a potential future risk. My sidewalk was perfectly flat. The curb was pristine. But Mrs. Gable, a woman who seemed to derive her life force from laminating rule sheets, had decreed that the mere possibility of a problem was a problem in itself. What she didn't know, what no one on that self-important board could possibly comprehend, was that in ordering the death of my tree, she wasn't just starting a fight with a retired woodworker. She was giving him the raw materials for his masterpiece. This isn't just a story about how I lost a tree. It's the story of how I made sure that every single resident, especially Mrs. Gable, would never be able to forget it. Have you ever seen petty tyranny backfire so beautifully? Stick around, and I'll tell you exactly how it happened. My first response was, of course, reason. I believed, naively as it turned out, that I was dealing with rational human beings. I drafted a polite, respectful letter to the HOA board. I explained the tree's personal significance, its history on the property predating the HOA itself, and the fact that it showed no signs of causing any actual damage. I even went a step further and paid out of my own pocket for a certified arborist, a man named Henderson with hands like worn leather and a deep respect for old trees, to conduct a full evaluation. His report was unequivocal. The oak was healthy, vibrant, and its root system was deep and stable, posing no immediate or foreseeable threat to the adjacent sidewalk. I attached his 3-page, professionally written assessment to my appeal and sent it off, confident that facts would prevail over fear-mongering. The rejection came not as a letter, but as a phone call from Mildred Gable herself. Her voice had the grating, self-assured quality of someone who has never been successfully contradicted. "Arthur," she began, using my first name with a familiarity that felt more like a power move than a kindness. "We've received your little petition." The way she said petition made it sound like I'd scrawled my grievances in crayon. "While we appreciate your personal attachment," she continued, oozing insincere sympathy, "the board's decision is final. The arborist you hired isn't on our approved vendor list, so his report is, frankly, irrelevant. The potential for risk is what matters, and we must be proactive in mitigating it." I tried to argue, to point out the absurdity of an approved list for an objective scientific opinion, but she cut me off. "The fines will begin next Monday if the removal is not scheduled. $10 a day. It's all in the bylaws, Arthur. Have a harmonious day." She hung up. That was when the frustration began to cool into something harder, something more focused. The injustice of it was a physical weight. They weren't just taking a tree. They were dismissing my history, my expertise, my reasonable efforts, all for the sake of a hypothetical crack in the pavement 30 years from now. That evening, I sat on my porch, looking at the great oak as the sunset painted its leaves in shades of orange and gold. It was a monument of patience and strength, and in its silent dignity, I found my resolve. They wanted it gone. They would use their rules and fines to bully me into submission. But they only saw a nuisance. They didn't see what I saw. They didn't see the grain, the heartwood, the story written in its rings. They saw a liability to be removed, while I was beginning to see an opportunity to be harvested. The find started as promised. Each day, a new slip of paper would appear in my mailbox, a crisp $10 insult. My neighbors, for the most part, were sympathetic but cowed. "It's a shame, Arthur," one would say, "but you know how Mildred is. It's easier not to fight." That sentiment, the quiet surrender to petty bureaucracy, was what truly galled me. It was a rot, and it was killing the spirit of our community far more surely than my oak tree's roots could ever threaten a sidewalk. The HOA escalated. Mrs. Gable, emboldened by my lack of immediate compliance, sent a certified letter threatening legal action and a lien against my property if I didn't remove the tree within 30 days. Her attack was becoming more personal, more venomous. I overheard her at the community mailbox telling another resident that my stubborn refusal was putting the entire neighborhood's property values at risk. It was a calculated campaign of misinformation, and it was working. I was being painted as the unreasonable one, the selfish old man who couldn't see past his own yard. It was time to stop reacting and start planning. I spent my evenings not in despair, but in research. I sat in my study, surrounded by my old woodworking books, the scent of cedar and sawdust still clinging to the pages. I pulled out the Harmony Creek HOA covenants, the very weapon they were using against me, and read them cover to cover. I read them until I understood the document structure, its loopholes, its built-in hypocrisies. And then I found it. Tucked away in a section on community assets and property was a clause about donations. The association may accept donations of property for the enhancement of community spaces, provided such donations are deemed beneficial, safe, and require minimal upkeep. It was beautiful. It was a Trojan horse, waiting to be built. My moment didn't come with a flash of lightning, but with the quiet click of a key in a lock. I wasn't just going to lose my tree. I was going to give it back to them, in a form they would be forced to accept and admire. The seed of my plan was planted. I would comply with their order. I would have the tree taken down, but it wouldn't be hauled away to a chipper or a landfill. Oh no, its life wasn't over. It was about to begin its most important work. I looked out the window at the oak, its branches reaching towards the sky like an open hand. They thought they were winning, but their threats and fines were breaking my spirit. In reality, they were just giving me the time I needed to sharpen my tools. There were no allies to be found, not really. My neighbors offered whispered condolences over the fence, but no one was willing to stand with me at an HOA meeting. They had their own gardens, their own satellite dishes, their own minor infractions they didn't want Mrs. Gable to notice. I was on my own, and that was fine. This was a personal project. So, I set my strategy in motion. The first step was a piece of theater. I called the HOA office, and, in a voice I made sure sounded defeated and weary, I informed them that I would be complying with the removal order. I could almost hear the smug satisfaction in the secretary's voice. I scheduled the tree removal for 2 weeks out, giving me time to make my own arrangements. I didn't call a standard tree felling company. I called a man I knew from my professional days, a specialist named Marcus who ran a small, portable sawmill. He didn't just cut trees down, he understood them. He knew how to read the tension in the wood, how to make cuts that would preserve the largest, most beautiful sections of the trunk. I explained the situation, and a slow grin spread across his face. "So, you don't want firewood," he said. "You want lumber. Revenge lumber." I just nodded. While I waited for the day of the felling, I retreated to my workshop. It had been mostly quiet since Clara passed, a place of memory. Now it came alive again. I cleaned and sharpened every tool. I drew up plans, not for one project, but for 5. 5 identical park benches, classical in design, sturdy and elegant. They would be large enough for 3 people to sit comfortably, with wide armrests and a slightly curved back. They would be built to last for a century, far longer than the flimsy metal and plastic monstrosities currently dotting the community park. All the while, Mrs. Gable grew more confident. She would march past my house on her daily patrols, a clipboard in hand, glancing at the oak with an air of finality. She saw a man who had been beaten, a problem that had been solved through sheer force of will. She saw a dead tree walking. Her arrogance was my shield, the perfect cover for my work. She was so focused on the victory of having the tree condemned that she never once considered what would happen to it after. To her, the story ended when the chainsaw started. For me, that's where it was just beginning. The day the tree came down was harder than I expected. Marcus and his crew arrived at dawn. The sound of the first chainsaw cut felt like a physical blow. I stood on my porch and watched as they worked with a surgeon's precision, carefully lowering massive branches with ropes and pulleys. Neighbors peeked out from behind their curtains, some with sympathy, others, I'm sure, with a sense of relief that the problem was being handled. Mrs. Gable was there, of course. She stood across the street, arms crossed, observing the proceedings like a general watching a successful siege. She wanted to witness her victory, to see the symbol of my defiance dismantled piece by piece. I let her watch. I let them all watch. I made sure to walk over to Marcus in full view of her and hand him a check, a public performance of my compliance. What she didn't see was the conversation that followed. "Keep the main trunk sections as long as possible," I murmured to him. "At least 8 feet. And I want the big Y branch, the one that faced the street. Quarter saw it if you can." Marcus just winked. "You'll have the best-looking revenge in the county." Arthur, by midday, the tree was gone. A gaping hole was left in the sky above my house. The yard felt naked, exposed. Mrs. Gable gave a single, satisfied nod and marched off, her work done. But my work was just starting. An hour later, a flatbed truck arrived. Instead of hauling the wood to a chipper, Marcus's team carefully loaded the massive, beautiful logs, the heart of my oak, and drove them not to a dump, but to his mill a few towns over. My lawn was empty, save for a sprawling stump that I would deal with later. The visual evidence of my surrender was complete. Over the next few weeks, the wood cured. And as it did, I prepared. I bought the best marine-grade varnish, the kind that would stand up to decades of sun and rain. I ordered 5 small, discreet brass plaques. The quiet of my home was now filled with a sense of purpose, a humming anticipation. The initial sting of loss was being replaced by the steady, methodical drive of the craftsman. I was no longer just a grieving homeowner. I was an artist preparing his medium. And my medium was the very thing my tormentor thought she had destroyed. The wood arrived back at my house 2 months later, planked, cut to my specifications, and stacked neatly in my garage. The smell was intoxicating. The rich, earthy scent of honest-to-goodness oak, a perfume of memory and potential. For the next 3 months, my life fell into a rhythm. I'd wake, drink my coffee while looking at the empty space where the oak used to be, and then head to the workshop. The work was slow and demanding, and I loved every second of it. Each pass of the hand plane, each cut of the saw, felt like an act of defiance. I was not destroying, I was creating. I was taking their act of negation and turning it into a positive. The wood was magnificent. It had a deep, honey-colored grain with darker, figuring running through it like veins. As I worked, I felt like I was collaborating with the tree, honoring its life. I planed the surfaces until they were as smooth as silk. I cut mortise and tenon joints, a classic technique that requires precision and patience, ensuring the benches would be incredibly strong without a single visible screw on their frames. This wasn't just carpentry. It was a conversation with the past. I'd remember Clara commenting on how the sunlight filtered through a particular branch, and I'd make sure the piece of wood from that section became a seat slat, where the sun would warm it again. I remember my son, Michael, scraping his knee climbing the trunk, and I found a small knot in the wood that looked like a tiny, healed-over scar. I made it the centerpiece of an armrest. These were not just benches. They were archives. They were reliquaries. Mrs. Gable and her board saw a $10 a day fine. I saw a legacy. As I entered the final phase of construction, the finishing, I felt a growing sense of anticipation. I applied coat after coat of the expensive varnish, hand sanding between each one, building up a protective layer that was as deep and luminous as glass. The wood's natural beauty shone through, seeming to glow from within. The last step was to attach the small brass plaques. I screwed them onto the backrest of each bench, perfectly centered. The engraving was simple, elegant, and devastatingly precise, donated to the community of Harmony Creek. In memory of the great oak of 14 Elm Street. 1923 to 2023 inch finally. They were done. 5 monuments of gleaming, solid oak sat in my workshop, silent and powerful. They were more beautiful than I had even imagined. My plan was ready. My evidence was built. All that was left was the delivery. The execution required a final piece of bureaucratic judo. I didn't just dump the benches in the park. I went through the official channels. I filled out a community asset donation form, the very one I discovered in the bylaws months ago. On the form, I described the donation in dry, official terms. 5 handcrafted, solid oak park benches, professionally finished with marine-grade varnish for maximum durability. For the estimated value section, I was brutally honest. Based on my time and the cost of similar custom-built furniture, I appraised each bench at $2,000. A total donation of $10,000. I attached photos of the gleaming benches and a copy of the receipt from Marcus's sawmill, proving the wood was sourced from the recently removed nuisance tree. I mailed the form via certified letter to the HOA office, addressed directly to the board. I knew what would happen. A $10,000 donation is not something a small HOA board can simply ignore. It would have to be discussed at the next public meeting. Refusing such a generous and high-quality gift, especially to replace the sad, rusted-out benches they currently had, would make them look petty, ungrateful, and foolish. Accepting it, however, meant accepting the story that came with them. They were caught. There were no minor setbacks. Everything went exactly as I calculated. 2 weeks later, the agenda for the upcoming monthly HOA meeting was posted on the community bulletin board. Tucked between discussion of holiday decoration guidelines and review of landscaping bids was the item: consideration of proposed community park donation from Mr. Arthur Pendleton. The stage was set. The night of the meeting, the community clubhouse was more crowded than usual. Word had gotten out. People were curious. I saw looks of confusion, intrigue, and in a few cases, the dawn of understanding on the faces of my neighbors. I took a seat in the back, content to wait. Mrs. Gable called the meeting to order, her face a mask of stern efficiency. She ran through the first few items on the agenda with her usual briskness. Then, she arrived at my donation. Next, she announced, her eyes scanning the room, we have a proposed donation from Mr. Arthur Pendleton. She held up my form, handling it as if it were contaminated. Mr. Pendleton has constructed some benches from the nuisance tree we had him remove and is offering them for placement in the park. She was trying to frame it as a bizarre, eccentric act. But then she made a fatal mistake. She stated the appraised value. He has valued these benches at $10,000. A collective gasp went through the room. $10,000 was a significant portion of their entire annual budget. You could feel the tide of opinion shift in that moment. It was no longer a weird old man's hobby project. It was a major philanthropic gift. The moment had arrived. Mrs. Gable, seeing the impressed looks on the faces of the residents, tried to regain control. Of course, she said with a dismissive wave of her hand, we would need to have the benches inspected for safety and durability. We can't just accept any old handmade items. A man in the front row, a quiet engineer named David who rarely spoke, raised his hand. Mildred, he said, I saw the pictures he attached. I'm a structural engineer. Those are mortise and tenon joints. That's not handmade. That's master craftsmanship. Those benches will outlast this clubhouse. The room murmured in agreement. Another woman chimed in. The benches we have now are awful. The paint is peeling, and I got a splinter last week. Mrs. Gable's face was beginning to flush. She was losing the room, and she knew it. This was my cue. I stood up and walked calmly to the front of the room. I wasn't angry. I wasn't smug. I was the very picture of a reasonable, grieving man who just wanted to do something nice. Mrs. Gable, members of the board, I began, my voice steady and clear. I don't want there to be any confusion. I looked out at the assembled faces of my neighbors. A few months ago, this board ordered me to destroy something that was very precious to me and my family. It was a healthy, beautiful tree that was part of this community's history long before any of us lived here. You called it a nuisance. You fined me. You threatened me with legal action. I paused, letting the words hang in the air. I complied, but I believe that nothing beautiful should ever be simply destroyed. It should be transformed. I turned to look directly at Mildred Gable. Her face was a thundercloud of shock and rage. She finally understood. She saw the trap, fully sprung. So I used my skills as a woodworker to give that tree a second life. I continued, my voice resonating with quiet power. I turned it into 5 benches so that the shade and comfort it provided in my yard can now be shared by the entire community. The donation is unconditional. All I ask is that you accept this gift, which is given freely in the spirit of making our neighborhood a more beautiful place. I then held up one of the small brass plaques I had brought with me. I read the inscription aloud, in memory of the great oak of 14 Elm Street. 1923 to 2023, the room fell into a profound silence. And then someone started clapping. It started with one person, then 2, then the entire room erupted in applause. They weren't just clapping for the benches. They were clapping for the sheer, poetic justice of it all. Mrs. Gable stood there, speechless, her authority evaporating before her very eyes. She had been publicly, humiliatingly outmaneuvered. Her petty tyranny had been turned into a monument of community goodwill, and she was powerless to stop it. She had to accept the gift. The bylaws, her own sacred texts, demanded it. And in doing so, she would have to install a permanent, beautiful, and very public reminder of her own defeat. The aftermath was more satisfying than I could have ever imagined. The board, faced with overwhelming public pressure and the undeniable value of the donation, voted unanimously to accept the benches. Mrs. Gable's eye was a barely audible squeak, a pathetic whimper of surrender. The following Saturday, the HOA's own maintenance crew, under my watchful eye, installed the 5 oak benches in the community park. They replaced the rickety old metal ones, which were unceremoniously hauled away. The new benches looked magnificent. They gleamed in the sun, solid and inviting. Almost immediately, they became the park's focal point. People were drawn to them. I'd see young mothers sitting on them while their kids played, elderly couples sharing a thermos of coffee, teenagers doing their homework. And every single person, at some point, would run their hand over the smooth wood and read the little brass plaque. It became a local legend, the story of Arthur's tree. The benches weren't just furniture, they were a narrative. They told a story of loss, of creativity, and of quiet, elegant defiance. For Mrs. Gable, the consequences were devastating. Her power was built on the perception of unassailable authority. I hadn't broken any rules. In fact, I had used her own rules to beat her. I had made her an unwilling accomplice in the immortalization of the very thing she had sought to erase. She was no longer seen as a strong leader, but as a petty tyrant who had been cleverly put in her place. The other board members began to distance themselves from her. At the next HOA election, 6 months later, she was resoundingly voted out of office. The new president, the engineer David who had spoken up for me, made his first active review of the bylaw I had been targeted with, adding a requirement for at least 2 independent arborist reports before any healthy tree could be condemned. The system had been reformed, not by shouting, but by craftsmanship. For me, the victory was quiet but profound. I had lost my tree, and that wound would always remain. But I hadn't lost its spirit. Every time I walked through the park, I would see my neighbors enjoying the benches. I'd see them sitting in the shade of new, young trees the HOA had planted as part of its reformed beautification program. I had transformed my personal grief into a shared community asset. I hadn't just gotten revenge. I had created a legacy. The tree was gone, but in a way, it was now more present than ever before, its strength and beauty woven into the daily life of the neighborhood it had watched over for a century. My life returned to its quiet rhythm, but something had fundamentally changed. The workshop was no longer just a place of memory, but a place of potential. The act of creating the benches had reawakened a part of me I thought had gone dormant. I found a new purpose not in fighting battles, but in building beauty out of unexpected places. The ordeal taught me a valuable lesson. It taught me that power isn't always held by those who make the most noise or write the most rules. True power can be found in patience, in skill, and in the quiet, methodical application of craft. Mrs. Gable's power was brittle, built on intimidation and the fine print of a binder. It shattered the moment it was met with something real, something tangible, something undeniably good. My power came from my hands, from my knowledge of wood, and from a love for something I was unwilling to let disappear without a trace. The moral of this story isn't just about getting even with a power-tripping HOA president. It's about the transformative power of creativity in the face of destruction. It's a reminder that the best response to petty tyranny is not to sink to its level, but to rise above it with grace and ingenuity. Don't just fight back, build something better. Let your response be so elegant, so constructive, that your opponent is forced to admire the result of their own folly. My great oak is gone from my yard, but it lives on in the heart of my community, a silent testament to the fact that you can cut down a tree, but you can't kill its legacy, especially when a stubborn old woodworker is determined to give it the last word. So let me ask you this. What tree in your life has someone tried to cut down? And what beautiful thing could you build from its remains? Thank you for listening, and don't forget to look for the stories hidden in the world around you. Sometimes the best ones are sitting right there on a park bench.